Welcome to Hirsch, and this is EdCast, a program created and produced by educators for everyone interested in education. The concept of social and emotional learning, or SEL, has been with us for a while, but the COVID-19 pandemic has created a greater focus on its importance. After 2 years of disruption and crises, our children are returning to school with myriad cognitive and emotional challenges. SEL provides a way of supporting students and addressing their learning, behavioral, and emotional issues. It provides the strategies and skills they will need to be successful in school and beyond. My guest today, David Adams, joins me to discuss what SEL is and ways that schools can implement successful SEL programs. Coming up now on EdCast. Joining me today is David Adams, the CEO of the Urban Assembly. He is on the board of directors for CASEL, the Collaborative for Academic, Social, and Emotional Learning, a trusted source for knowledge about high-quality, evidence-based social and emotional learning. Rounding out his resume, and no doubt lending his work a broader perspective, he also served as a civil affairs officer in the United States Army. Thank you so much for joining us today on EdCast.
Linda, thanks so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
As you know, we've been hearing an awful lot about SEL, and I know it is your area of expertise. So I want to ask you, first of all, what is SEL?
Well, it's a great question, Linda, and I'm going to give you the simple explanation of what social and emotional learning is, and then we can get to some of the more technical aspects of social and emotional learning and some of the more official understandings of the work. So here at the Urban Assembly, we really focus on social and emotional learning being how students interact with themselves, how they interact with others, and how they solve problems. So those three concepts, interacting with yourself, interacting with others, and then solving problems, really form the grounding of what social and emotional learning is. Now, if we take those ideas and we move towards a more complicated definition, we think about in CASEL defining social and emotional learning as the integral part of education and human development. It's a process by which all young people and adults acquire the knowledge, skills, and attitudes to develop healthy identities, manage emotions, and achieve personal and collective goals, as well as feel empathy towards others, establish and maintain supportive relationships, as well as making caring and responsible decisions. So at the end of the day, all those things are really consolidated in this notion of how am I relating effectively to myself? How am I relating effectively to others? And how am I integrating those things to solve problems effectively as well?
So we're going to get to some specifics soon. I just want to ask you, how is it similar or different to an emotional IQ?
It's a great point, right? So we know that social and emotional learning as a field was really catalyzed by the publishing of Dan Goleman's IQ, or emotional intelligence book around 1992-ish, right? We knew that the theory of emotional intelligence was developed at Yale University by Peter Salovey and Jack Mayer, who were really looking at emotional intelligence as another way of information gathering to solve problems. And so the social part of that is how are we interacting with others, right? So what are the skill development opportunities? How do we understand the norms of a community or a society? How are we understanding the body language of other people? And then we layer that on emotional intelligence, which is looking at recognizing, understanding, labeling, expressing, and regulating emotions. And that's how you get your social and emotional field in which we're integrating the social aspects of problem solving, the emotional aspects of problem solving into one field in which we're working with young people to solve problems in the social and emotional domains.
I mentioned in my opening that the concept of SEL had been around for a while, but it's really taken prominence right now. Why do you think that the pandemic has kind of pushed us into this prominence for SEL?
There's a lot of different reasons, Linda, and I appreciate the question. My own children were in remote learning for about 2 years. And what I watched my children do was struggle with the social and emotional dimensions of learning. So I remember my son Isaiah was working on sounding out a word. And he came to me and let's say the word was water. And he said, can you help me with this word? And I said, let's sound it out. And he said, water, and he sounded it out. And I actually didn't offer him any kind of cognitive supports. I didn't get into the phonetics. I didn't help him identify the W and the R. I just helped him feel my presence to move through what Vygotsky would call zone of proximal development, that supportive adult, in order to access the knowledge that he already has, right? And so I think people watched this and said, my goodness, education is about so much more than what we are just teaching. It's also about the relationships that are supporting the learning. It's about the challenges that students face when they're not in the context of a supportive adult or a supportive peer. And then they came back to school and they said, we want to make sure that our young people are graduating and learning more than just what the content is saying. Maybe we want them to learn how to persist. We want them to learn how to solve problems. We want them to learn how to be independent. We want them to learn how to communicate their needs and wants effectively. And I think the pandemic matched this with the mental health crisis, specifically looking at teenagers when social isolation really increased the rate of suicidality in terms of hospitalization, and increased the rate of isolation of particularly high school girls. And returning to school means that we need to attend to that whole child and remember what our schools are for, which is building college, career, and community in our society.
I have to say that it's wonderful having a guest who references Vygotsky's zone of proximal development, let me just say, but let me move on. One of the things I guess I'm thinking, can schools really teach social and emotional learning?
Well, the good answer is without question, the answer is yes. If you look back at the Aspen Commission's National Commission on Social Emotional Academic Development, there was a research consensus, and it took scientists from across the learning fields. So we had cognitive scientists, we had learning scientists, we had educational folks, we had neuroscientists, right? All these folks came together and developed a consensus of principles, a consensus of statements around the science of social and emotional learning. And one of the first things that they said is these skills are teachable and they're learnable, right? So we know social and emotional development is a developmental process. Self-management is connected to the age of a young person, and it unfolds along the developmental process. But we also know that we can teach it and enhance that process so that young people are more cognizant and intentional about how they apply those skills. So we know in schools that having caring adults support social emotional development. We know supportive learning environments help students develop their social emotional outcomes. But we also know that explicit development of these skills creates constructs and contexts so that young people can say, I'm going to work on my decision making. I'm going to apply and activate my self-management. I'm going to think about the language of self-awareness and apply that to this frustrating math task that I'm working on, name that emotion, and then regulate it so that we can move forward. So without question, we know that schools can do this work. And we know that when schools do this work, young people benefit.
Now, I've heard you mention the applicability of SEL to urban youth in particular. And you've given some examples that I heard about why you think it's so important. Can you talk a little bit about that and ways in which you've used SEL in that more challenging environment, I think?
Yeah, it's a great question. The first thing I'd say is that all students benefit from the intentional development of social and emotional skills. It's the same way I think we talk about language acquisition. I think this is something that is near and dear to your heart. It's both a developmental process in which students are listening to the sounds of their parents, but it's also an instructional process by which when students go to school, they start to learn about the structures of language. So it goes from implicit knowledge, which is just listening to parents, to explicit knowledge, in which they're really able to think about subject, verbs, and periods at the end of that sentence. And social emotional skill development is the same way. It's a developmental process. It's the result of interactions with caring and supportive adults, but it's also an instructional aspect of it in which students start to understand what are the explicit things that are happening so that they move from intentional or implicit, I should say, to explicit understanding of those skills. Now, when you're talking about students in urban environments who really benefit from that explicit development so that they can interact with the world within their intentions, when our students have exposure to that explicit opportunities, they're much more likely to be able to solve problems in ways that meet their intent. And that's very important because, as we know, in environments in which high stress, in environments in which they are not as supportive as they could be, that intentionality of problem solving makes sure that our students can be the best versions of themselves, solve the problems that they need to solve, and move forward and support society.
Now, you've had tremendous experience using SEL, I mean, in different areas. So let's talk a little bit about how you have seen SEL in action and the kinds of things that you have seen accomplished.
Well, here at the Urban Assembly, we've been working with social and emotional learning for about 7 years. As part of our Resilient Scholars program, we were supporting systemic social and emotional learning, where we integrated the concepts of social and emotional learning throughout the 5 domains of school life: extracurricular activities, instructional practices, behavioral supports, as well as social and emotional supports and adult social and emotional development. And what we've seen is when we do this work well, students benefit. Not only do their grades go up, but the supportive learning environment in schools go up. We see that attendance is impacted in a positive way. And most importantly, we see young people who are able to articulate their social and emotional strengths and challenges and apply those ideas to the community, to their school, as well as to the world of work. I'll give you a good example here. I had a young man learning about social emotional skills, conflict resolution, and he was a middle schooler. And we asked him this question, as we do: how have you applied the skills that you've learned? And his parents were getting a divorce, they were in conflict. So he went home and he said, well, I try to get my parents to use iMessages because I know that if they used iMessages, they could be less fighting and communicate more effectively. Now, unfortunately, it didn't work out. They still got a divorce. But he was really cognizant of this notion that the skill that we were teaching in social and emotional learning could be applied to a completely different problem set in terms of the scenario, but a similar situation, which is conflict at home.
Have you seen kids use it to resolve conflicts among themselves?
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I think the most important, some of the most important work that we see is when we translate and transfer these skills from things like restorative practices to students themselves. One of the biggest things I think we see when we see restorative practices, we see is an adult mediating conflict between 2 students. But we know at the end of the day, what we really want to see is students mediating conflict between themselves, using things like active listening, using things like I statements, using things like perspective taking in order to move towards a space where that conflict is not mediated by an adult, but that young people can get to that outcome themselves rather than having an adult do it for them.
So these are really wonderful goals that we want to see. We want to see these things happen. And of course, that takes me to my next question. What does a SEL curriculum look like? If I want to know that my school is doing something about this, what are some of the practices? What are some of the things that I'm looking for that tell me that this school is paying attention to social and emotional learning?
Another great question, Linda. Thank you. So we know that social emotional learning, right, happens every day, regardless if we are intentional or not. So there's a school out there that has no SEL curriculum, that has never heard about social emotional learning, that's still impacting the social and emotional outcomes of their young people. The question is, how do we make that more intentional? All right, and if we made that more intentional, what would it look like? So it would look like direct instruction, just like you said. It would look like an opportunity to develop these ideas in students in a specific and explicit way. That way, students know what it is that they're working on. I can identify opportunities to apply those skills in school and out of school and work on it across the school day. So you would look like direct instruction in that. Now, the next thing would look like is integration of those skills explicitly throughout the day. So once I've learned the skill, I want and I need opportunities to practice it. How would I know and internalize something that I don't have a chance to practice? So you'd walk into a school and a teacher would say, hey, folks, it's time to do a turn and talk. And she would prompt the students to use their active listening skills to make sure that they're listening to the perspective of the other student as they're doing that turn and talk. It would also look like if you're doing things like English language arts, how does the perspective taking opportunity of the character, or how does the perspective taking of the student apply to understand what's happening in the character's life or the emotional kind of state? The other thing it would look like is opportunities to practice it in real life. So things like extracurricular activities. How does responsible decision-making activated when we are in a group activity like basketball and we're all responsible for what happens as a team? So a parent would come into a school and she would see some really clear direct instruction. And then he or she would look at the integration of these things in academics, and students and teachers will be able to articulate what that looks like. And then extracurricular activities as well would reflect these principles of social emotional development.
I know you've said that schools are doing social and emotional learning, whether they're intentional or not, but I'm willing to say that they might even do it badly because, I could see where you could do it badly, where you could not respect when students express themselves, when you not give them an opportunity. There are lots of things that I see that could happen that really work against students. So I'd like to ask you, how do we prepare teachers? Are they prepared for this? And what do they need to know to be ready to implement some of these practices?
Well, I think when you said that they're doing it poorly or they could be doing
Well,
it
you
poorly,
could.
yeah, I want to really like think about the learning piece of that, right? Social and emotional learning, right? And the verb here is learning. And so what is it that our kids are learning when social and emotional skill sets are not developed or they're not developed in an intentional way? Right. And I think that's the question when we say, is it poor? Is it good? To me, is less about good, poor, and more about
Right
what is being learned.
there.
Right. If what's being learned is that emotions don't matter, well, that's not only inaccurate, but is damaging to students' development. If what's being learned is managing yourself is only your responsibility, well, again, not only inaccurate, but damaging to students. And so when we think about what's being learned in schools or in systems that are not intentionally attending to the social emotional development of young people, it's a crapshoot. And so our job is to be intentional. What is it that we care about? What kind of young person should be the result of the inputs of our K-12 system? And when we ask ourselves that question, the answer will be a social emotional development plan that is resulting in young people who can solve those problems.
So how do you prepare teachers for that?
Yeah, so the first thing we need to do is really get into the science of learning and the science of learning and development. I think over the last 20 years, the science of learning has really been revolutionized, and everything from neuroscience to just the science of reading itself has really emphasized the role of interactions and the role of the environment in helping young people learn. Going back to our good friend Vygotsky, who presaged these kinds of ideas, uh, interactions are what drive learning. And so I think what our teachers need to really understand is that when students are interacting with content, when they're interacting with each other, when they're interacting with ideas, they learn. And those are the social and emotional dimensions of learning that need to be elevated. The cognitive part of the brain, the social part of the brain, and the emotional part of the brain are all integrated. We pay attention to things that are important to us, right? We are intent on things that matter. When we are in safe learning environments, we are more likely to retain information. So that idea that cognitive, social, and emotional development are all operating on the same circuitry in the brain is something I think that teachers really need to understand and then apply to the way that they think about teaching and learning in their classrooms.
And so do you work with teachers on this? Is there PD in schools that help them reach that point?
Absolutely. Here at the Urban Assembly, we worked deeply with our teachers to ensure that the implementation leads of social emotional learning have a really clear sense of what social emotional learning is and how to integrate it into the instructional formats of the classroom. We've also supported the rollout of Strong Resilient NYC in New York City, in which we planned and executed the training for about 75,000 educators, as well as certified about 5,000 social emotional leads who will ensure that the knowledge of social emotional learning is embedded and integrated into their schools across the city.
I want to go back to teachers again for 1 minute. So many are leaving the profession, and there are so few education majors in graduate schools right now. Do you think teachers themselves need some social and emotional support? And can we give that to them in some way?
It's a great question. Something we looked very deeply into with regards to the pipelines for educators within an urban assembly. I know Linda Darling-Hammond has been really focused on this over in California. It is a challenge. And I think when we think about the social and emotional supports that teachers have, the person's research, I think, who is most applicable to this has to be Mark Greenberg and Kim Schornet-Reichel, who have really focused on how do we create environments in which teachers are supported. And there's some good research there around mindfulness techniques that support resilience of teachers. There's some good research there. on the relationship between teacher practice and principal support. And I think if we understand how to support our principals, support our teachers, we're going to reduce the amount of turnover that we see on a daily basis here in New York City and beyond.
I know there's been some criticism about SEL that it possibly detracts from academic learning. And yet you've said here a number of times that it most certainly does not, that it makes it stronger. Can you tell us a little about the research that supports SEL in this area?
Absolutely. So one of the things that social emotional learning brings to the educational space is evidence. It's not as if Castle, for example, were the first people to think about the importance of self-management or self-awareness in society, but they were the first folks to come together and put a research base in order to help educators understand what the impact of that is. So let's look at what that research base says, right? The research base says that there's a meta-analysis around social and emotional learning. And that meta-analysis is a collection of a large range of other research studies, right? And it's been recently updated, I think in 2017. But what that research says is about 11% increase in academic outcomes for students who are exposed to social emotional competencies. That research says that 20 years after exposure to high quality social and emotional programs, students are less likely to be involved in criminal behavior, less likely to use drugs and alcohol. Students are less likely to have mental health challenges that are diagnosable. Students are more likely to be in supportive relationships. Students are more likely to be employed, right? Less likely to be on public assistance. So when you think about what the purpose of schools are, which is to prepare young people to contribute to community, this is a really key foundation of what that looks like. So it doesn't take away from academics. It enhances academics as well as enhances our society.
We are running out of time. I want to give you an opportunity just to tell us about SEL Day, which is coming up in March. So what should we know about SEL Day?
Well, what you have to know about SEL Day is that this is an opportunity for folks across the world to participate in elevating the importance of social and emotional learning. You can go to socialemotionallearningday.org, that's selday.org, and then you could be part of a huge movement that last year had 14 million folks who are involved in that. We had 51 states involved. We had 69 countries. We had proclamations from the United States Congress, 7 additional states, and we had over 200 school districts organize themselves to elevate the work of social and emotional learning, making sure that the rest of the country, the rest of the world knew this work is important to our young people. We're going to do the same thing this year. Go to selday.org to sign up.
We will put it up on screen for you, okay?
Thank you.
One final thought, can SEL make us a better nation?
Sure can. When we think about the skills that social emotional learning can help support and facilitate, active listening, perspective taking, conflict resolution, self-awareness, the sense of community, these are the skills that will help us move together forward in community in our society. So SEL can help us, SEL will help us, and it takes us to make that happen every day.
Thank you so much. This has been a wonderful conversation. It actually made me feel better already. So I want to thank you for joining us today, David Adams, CEO of the Urban Assembly. Thank you.
Thank you for having me, Linda.
Sure. Don't go away. We'll be right back with our Ed Bites. Welcome back to this edition of Ed Bites. We don't usually equate the stresses on teachers with that of air traffic controllers, but studies from the 1980s and 1990s indicated that they each make about the same number of decisions per day, over 1,500, or about 3 decisions per minute in an 8-hour workday. But researchers feel that new technologies, concerns for students' emotional health, and the COVID-19 pandemic have greatly increased the number of decisions teachers must make to beyond 1,500. One pre-kindergarten teacher noted, decision-making is absolutely nonstop throughout the day. As a follow-up to our recent program on supporting special needs students, we report that the National Center for Learning Disabilities released some recommended strategies for supporting the learning needs of students with disabilities. These include providing inclusive, accessible instruction, enriched with social and emotional learning activities, and engaging families in their children's education. Once again, it seems that preconceived gender notions might influence the interest girls show in science. Smart Brief reports that findings in the proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences also showed that only 35% of girls were drawn to a computer science activity when they were told that boys were more interested in it. But 65% of girls were interested in the same activity when told that girls and boys were equally interested in it. According to a new study, white characters continue to dominate children's books and school texts. The review conducted by New America found that literary and educational materials do not reflect the diversity among the nation's school children, and many reinforce stereotypes. Characters of color are underrepresented, as are female characters. One 2020 study of books that won the coveted Newbery Medal, an award for children's literature, found that only 20% of Black characters and 25% of Asian American characters were female. That's it for this edition of EdCast. Thanks for joining us. See you next time.
We'd like to hear from you. Please send your thoughts and comments to cunyedcast@gmail.com.